Today, we continue on our look through the New Testament. And if you've been here with us since the beginning of the year, we've been on this journey to read 5 chapters every week. And that brings us to the end of John today and into the beginning of Acts. And so I want to do just a couple of things in our time together today. And that's one is make that transition for us, help us see that transition. 2 is just talk a little bit about our confirmation process, right? A lot of you are here for our confirmands, these 17 young men and women who are here to affirm their faith. And so as we've looked at our confirmation process, it really does start when we start sharing Bible stories, right? And all the way through 5th grade in our Sunday school program, we help kids understand and learn Bible stories. And once they get to 6th grade and 7th grade, we begin to put that together. And we do that through a Bible overview, right? So we can see what it's like to look at the Bible from like a 30-foot ceiling and what it's all about. And really that's about being connected to Jesus. And then we also help them go through the small catechism, which is Martin Luther's writings that he helped and hoped that families could get into so they could know what it was like to be connected to Jesus. And so we spend a year just looking at that and diving in a little bit deeper. And then 8th grade year, which is where we are here today, we put it all together. And we really look at processing life experiences because we know that God's word is living and active and it's in all of us. And so if it's in all of us and it's living and active, then we experience it. And as we experience it, we can process through it. And so we've done that through these things called Kairos moments. And that comes from Acts 3. And we're going to read that in, I think, next week's readings. But really what it is it's the things that we read or happen in our lives that give us pause. And I thought it would be really good just to walk you through my process of what it's like and what I've walked our confirmands through. And especially as we look at this transition from the book of John into the book of Acts. And so every time I read this story, the one phrase that always gives me pause and makes me think is this: you will be my witnesses. It's a very judicial term, right? It's something that we don't hear all the time. It's not something that we just walk around on the streets and say, hey, would you be a witness to this or that? But we have an idea of what it's about, right? Just as I was talking to the kids, it's about telling the truth and the story of being connected to whatever event we're a witness of. And so if that's the case, then what is it that Jesus is telling his disciples and he's telling us about? And really we look at that through a processing, it's called experiential learning, and asking 3 simple questions. What is the context? So what? So what connects into my life? And then 3, now what? Now what am I being asked to do about it? So as I've looked at this phrase, you will be my witnesses, the context really varies. Because if we read it in line where we read all 4 Gospels and then we move into Acts, we go from John into Acts. And John didn't write Acts, but actually Luke did. And so that is a continuous story. But we still see some of the same pieces of the puzzle in John. They just look a little bit different or might sound different because of the words he uses. And so today we're going to flow from in that direction out of John. And if we look at that context, what is the context? We really see that Jesus' disciples are connected to him, right? We see this in Mary Magdalene. Here's a woman that we know from earlier in our readings in Luke, had 7 demons that she was possessed with that Jesus released her from. So she's not someone that you might think about hanging out with, but here she is. She's the first person in this account that Jesus talks to, and he simply says her name, Mary. How amazing would it be to have Jesus just say your name to you? I think about that and I think, wow, that's pretty incredible. And then we see later on in the account that the disciples are all in the upper room again. And they're fearful. They're fearful because the people who put Jesus on the cross, not because he deserved it, but simply because they hated him that much for his radical message of love and forgiveness, they're still there. It's not like they crucified him and then all of a sudden leadership changed over and everything is good. They really have no idea what's going to happen to them as disciples of a risen Jesus. But he comes to them and he says, peace be with you. Don't be afraid. I am here. Look at me. Peace be with you. I've come to you. And in those words, it's more than just simple words of friends, because Jesus knows the men and women in this room. He knows that there are people who are cheaters. There are people who are liars. There are people who doubt. There are people who are just trying to make a day's wage, and sometimes you maybe didn't do things fairly, or whatever the case may be. He knows each and every person in that room, and he knows their brokenness, and he knows their sin. But he doesn't just leave it at one peace be with you. He says it again. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. I am sending you where you're at because, you know what? You have a story to tell. I think that's exactly what he's telling them. That it's not really about their perfect lives and getting it just right. Because we know that the men and women in that room sin just like we do. But he's saying, you know what? In your connection, you've got a story to share. You're connected to me, which means you've got something that you can take into the world. And so we ask, what about us? We're connected to Jesus, so what does this mean for us? What's the now what? Oh, I skipped one, sorry. I do that sometimes. So what? So it's this idea of being sent out, right? Jesus sends these men and women out, just where they're at, into the world, and their stories connect with other stories, and generationally it goes down the line until we're here today. And so as we see this in context, we know that we are connected to Jesus because we have a shared story with the disciples, a shared story with the generation that has gone before us, a shared story with the generation that will go on. As Jesus says, you will be my witnesses, he's connecting us into his story. And those are good words, and we could just leave it at that. Go and be a witness. But I think we have to dive in just a little bit more. And so we go to that question of now what? Now what? And here's a really interesting thing that I found as I was kind of diving into this a little bit more. And that is, in the English language, we really have three tenses, right? You have past, present, and future. In the Greek language that the New Testament was written in, they have a lot more. They go in pretty deep on what verbs can mean. And so in this, where it says, you will be, it goes beyond just a future. It's a future indicative middle. That's how they would kind of classify it. And what that means is that there is nothing that can stop you from being my witness. In all of the world, in all of the ages, in all of the things that happen in our lives, there is nothing that will stop us from being his witnesses. Which is really interesting if you think about it, because if you're like me, sometimes we forget words. Last night when we were here and gathered, I forgot the word background check because I was talking about that with VBS a little bit, right? Just couldn't think of it. Didn't come. We don't get the words sometimes. Sometimes our actions aren't exactly what they should be. Sometimes we're kind of mean. Sometimes we're kind of selfish. Sometimes that things just don't go right and we get mad. Sin covers us in all we do, and yet, here is Jesus saying, you will be my witnesses. And here's where I think this comes in. If we are connected to Jesus, if we are becoming more like him every day, if we belong in his church and we find community amongst each other, and we're in it to win it together because we know his love and forgiveness covers us, and we take the time to bless the world around us because of what he has done, that means we have a story that's living inside us. It means that no matter what we do, we're sharing Jesus with the world around us. Even if we don't get it right, there's still an element of him in us being seen by others. So as we have these 17 young men and women who are here today who are affirming their faith, they're saying, yes, I'm a part of that story. Yes, this Jesus who loves me and forgives me, and I have an identity in him because he has claimed me as his child, as a child of God. It means that as they live their lives, they're a witness. Not because they get it right every time, because none of us can, but simply because he is in them and they shine for him. Another way of putting this would be asking the question, how is God speaking into your life? Right? Because if we can answer that question, we can answer that, like, what is it for me to be a witness? Where is he asking me to witness and live a life that shines his love and his forgiveness to those around him? And that's the challenge. I think that's the challenge for each of us this week, is to ask that question. And if you're joining us in our reading plan and you get to Acts 1:8 and you start thinking about being a witness, my hope is that you ask that question along with it. How is God speaking into my life? And there's no perfect answer. This isn't something that I can stand up here and say, oh, for you it's this, and for you it's this, and for you it's this. No, this is personal. We have a personal God who loves each and every one of us for who we are, and he speaks into our lives in personal ways. And so this week, as we go through our week, as we go through our reading plans, as we encourage these confirmands, as we look at how God uses us, the challenge is to ask the question, how is God speaking into my life? And then how can he make that happen? How can he make that happen? And I hope that all of us can answer that in some way, shape, or form. We've heard it from the confirmands as they've given their testimonies, as they've given their confirmation speeches. Each one of them has come up with a verse, and they've talked about this whole process and the now what of what is this going to mean for me in the future as I go forward? What is it that God's speaking into my life through this verse? And so taking their example, my hope is that you can do the same over this next week. Maybe not write a speech, but spend moments in prayer and in thought asking, God, what are you speaking into my life today? What are you speaking into my life today? Because our risen Jesus didn't just speak to Mary and the other disciples saying, peace be with you. He speaks into our lives as well. And so we can ask the question, God, how are you speaking into our lives today? Amen? Amen.